Nicolas, can you talk about your professional background? How did you get involved in this field?
So I came out of medicine and philosophy and became a medical anthropologist and did a laboratory ethnography during the preclinical phase of the psychedelic renaissance in the mid-2000s of two neuropsychopharmacology labs. One was Franz Vollenweider's lab in Zurich and the other was Mark Geyer's lab in San Diego. And I've basically been following the psychedelic renaissance from an ethnographic and historical angle ever since. And, of course, it's very interesting to see it now in this clinical phase, which is raising many different and new problems, and at the same time it brings the original impulse to bring psychedelics into mainstream society to fruition if it works, right? And given the FDA decision or advisory board decision from 2 or 3 days ago, things seem very much in flux now, and I think it's a fascinating story and kind of a breaking point, basically.
Some people say we are moving too fast and there is an overhype of psychedelics. What do you think about that?
In the medical historical literature, the Dutch historian of medicine, Snelders, describes how psychotropic drugs go through career cycles, and it always starts with the substance being hyped, then there is an anti-hype, and eventually there is a more balanced, pragmatic perspective on its benefits and harms. What I think is really interesting about psychedelics is that they went through this whole career cycle once with hype, anti-hype, and then they never got to the balanced point because they were prohibited. And then it restarted. And when I got into this field in the mid-2000s, I was actually thinking that I was witnessing the more balanced approach, because at least on the side of the Hefter Research Institute, where I did most of my research, you had a pretty sober perspective that emphasized, trade-offs and was skeptical of medical applications, actually. And it seemed as if, that third phase had finally come. But instead, you had a whole new cycle that started again. And suddenly, with the clinical phase, they got hyped again. And then in recent years, we've seen the anti-hype beginning to come up, and they're not happening sequentially. So there still is hype going on, and there is also anti-hype. And what I find really fascinating about the anti-hype is that is not a repetition of history, because the anti-hype does not come from a conservative establishment primarily, but the anti-hype is coming from within the psychedelic community, from people who are hostile to medicalization or who are introducing Me Too-like elements into the discourse. Whereas in US Congress, for example, in 2022, there were 2 bipartisan initiatives for more financial support for psychedelic research, which is absolutely mind-blowing, given that US Congress cannot agree on anything, right? Everything is polarized. I mean, even gas stoves are polarized and politicized at this point. And the one thing that enables bipartisan initiatives is psychedelics, which were the most polarizing class of substances in the 60s you could think of. Is it moving too fast? No, I don't think it's moving too fast. I mean, there certainly is I think mistakes were made on the way, but these were not primarily about the pace of doing the research.
In your book, you write that psychedelics have the promise of moksha in the age of soma. Can you explain this?
Aldous Huxley's work has informed certainly the first, or depending on how you count, second wave of psychedelic research in the 1950s and 1960s very deeply, and it continues to inform how people in the psychedelic renaissance think about psychedelics. Huxley wrote two important novels that deal with drugs. The first one is Brave New World from 1932, in which he imagined a drug called soma, which makes people complacent and okay with their living conditions under a totalitarian system. And the second novel is an anti-utopian novel titled Island from 1962, in which he had basically reversed his take on drugs. And interestingly, the substance that he imagines in that book is very closely modeled on psilocybin and LSD, and it's called moksha. And in many ways, it has similarities to soma, and the uses are quite similar, but they're all turned into positive uses. And the psychedelic renaissance basically got going in the 1990s at about the same time as Prozac became popular, with Peter Kramer's Listening to Prozac being the book that really hyped Prozac. That basically started a hype cycle for SSRIs. And the critiques of the SSRI use were often modeled on Huxley's Brave New World. So in the early 2000s, President Bush had the President's Council on Bioethics, which was led by the bioethicist Leon Kass, and Kass explicitly framed the use of SSRIs in terms of Brave New World. That was the theme that kept coming up. And at the same time, the psychedelic renaissance very slowly started to build up, and it reintroduced moksha, well, the real thing that moksha was modeled on, into this period when the concern, the main social concern was revolving around Brave New World. And of course, the idea of moksha was that it would enable people to live an authentic life, to experience a form of ontological security, and to become who they really were, right? By modeling their life in the light of mystical experiences where their finite mind becomes one with an infinite mind, right? That was basically Huxley's mystical vision.
It seems nowadays the psychedelic movement has less ambitions than in the 60s, so they don't want to change the world, they just want to medicalize these substances.
I think that is partially true. If you look at Rick Doblin, for example, his ambitions are still pretty grandiose. The vision of net zero trauma by 2070, for example, or the prevention of future holocausts, is definitely in the tradition of this, world-changing projects of the 1960s. But at the same time, there are many other actors who are more modest in their goals and And modesty is relative, right? I mean, the idea that you would resolve a global mental health crisis with psychedelics is still pretty megalomanic. But the path to that is medicalization and bringing a drug to market, and there is a rigid regulatory system which has emerged or consolidated since the 1960s, and they have to play by those rules, right? And of course, the psychedelic renaissance from the start, and I would say all major players in it wanted to mainstream psychedelics. The main idea of the psychedelic renaissance was a break with the counterculture and to bring psychedelics into the culture, and that means into cultural institutions, and cultural institutions are rule governed, and that means you have to find a space for these wild substances in a rule governed world, and I think that's part of the drama that's playing out.
Can we make psychedelics a standardized medical treatment because they come with so much spiritual and metaphysical baggage?
But medicalizing psychedelics will certainly push the envelope for how we understand medicalization, right? I mean, they're not going to become antidepressants or antipsychotics the way we know them, where you give somebody a prescription and they take their pill every day, because people wouldn't be taking them every day, and because the experiences are pretty difficult to contain. And I mean, that's why there is a sense that they have to be reined in by therapists, and that you need to create an entire apparatus or a kind of social framework around these substances that will enable this to happen in a way that doesn't wreak havoc. And that's not how we usually think of medical treatments. And it's going to be expensive, and it's creating all sorts of chaotic processes around these treatments, whether these are the kind of romantic engagements that have been attacked as sexual abuse situations in psychedelic therapies, or whether it's people having some metaphysical belief change and wanting to change their life very dramatically. And all of these things are going to pose serious problems that you just wouldn't see with the medicalization of other classes of substances.
Unlike traditional antidepressants, in the case of psychedelics, it is very important in what environment you use drugs and in what mental state. Can you explain us the role of set and setting?
So, set means a user's mindset, and setting means the social and cultural and physical environment in which they're taking the substance. And there is a long-standing consensus that both set and setting shape people's psychedelic experiences. So the experience induced by the drug is not exclusively derived from an interaction between the molecule and a person's brain, but there are other extra pharmacological factors which are modulating this experience. There is a lot of literature, especially anthropological literature, that you can trace back to the late 19th century that has documented this. There is not a lot of experimental neuropsychopharmacological literature on set and setting. there are some papers which even suggest that the role of set and setting has been overemphasized. So, for example, Erich Studerus from Franz Vollenweider's lab in Zurich published a paper about a decade ago in which they compared the experiences of people in different settings in the lab, that is PET scanner versus EEG laboratory versus a living room-like space, and they did not differ very dramatically. So of course these are relatively minor differences compared to somebody taking the substance in a lab versus somebody taking it with their friends in the forest. But I think it's certainly worth considering that to some extent, the setting is not as all-determining as, for example, Timothy Leary made people believe, right? Leary famously said that 99% of the effects are due to the setting, and I think there still is a pretty significant dimension of the drug, and it's lots of different factors, right? What people bring to the experience in a given moment, their personality, their pharmacogenomics, and so on. But for sure, all of these extra pharmacological factors need careful management. And I think it's an interesting moment in drug development because, neuropsychopharmacological drug development got into a deep crisis around 2010. Basically, all the big pharmaceutical corporations have withdrawn from central nervous system drug development since then, and they have not re-engaged. The only class of substances that has attracted a lot of attention and that inspired optimism in the past decade were basically psychedelics. And that often went along with the idea of a paradigm shift in psychiatric treatment, that you would combine pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. And of course, psychotherapy is, a certain kind of setting in which you're working on people's mindset. So it means that you would have to think of this as a form of drug development that already includes the extra pharmacological factors that are modulating the drug effects. And I think that is a very interesting new model, but it poses a lot of problems and questions that we have not really been able to answer. First of all, there are very few studies of how these extra pharmacological factors affect the drug effects. And as far as psychedelic therapies are concerned, I think that is a major problem because the most important extra pharmacological factor, presumably, is the therapy. And there is no controlled trial that would control for the therapy component. All the trials that we have seen so far are placebo-controlled trials that compare drug with placebo, but not giving drug to both arms while, giving them therapy or no therapy, or giving them cognitive behavioral therapy versus psychoanalysis, or, whatever you would want to compare. And then there is the regulatory problem that, all the regulatory agencies are tasked with regulating drugs, not psychotherapies, and they don't know how to deal with that.
Some people would keep psychedelics under strict medical supervision. But do you think there is a room for psychedelics outside of the medical realm?
Oh, there certainly is room for psychedelics outside of medical settings. There has been a room for basically ever since humans have been using psychedelics. The medical setting is the latecomer to the party, right? The medical setting is something that was only introduced in the 1950s and is being developed more systematically now in the psychedelic renaissance. We don't even know whether that's going to be a use that will be successfully institutionalized. The ethnologist Bernd Brabeck de Mori, for example, published a paper a few years ago in which he argued that in traditional shamanic uses, the therapeutic effect is attributed to the shaman, not to ayahuasca. And it is the shaman who takes the ayahuasca so that he can do his job better, and the drug is not given to the patients. I'm not sure if that is true across the board, because of course you have, rites of passage, such as, use of peyote by the Huichol to become like a full-blown member of the Huichol community and so on, where basically everybody participates in the rituals, and those are not healing rituals. But you could, with maybe a little bit of hyperbole, argue that it is Westerners who recently got into this medicalized idea of giving psychedelics to sick people. And maybe in some sense we are the first who are giving psychedelics to sick people, and it's not clear that that is a good idea, right? That's what all the clinical trials are ultimately about, to establish that. And if you think about the Western psychedelic culture, I mean, it has mostly been recreational uses, hedonistic uses, spiritual uses. Again, the medical uses are, part of the picture, but not the key part. They have become the key part now in the psychedelic renaissance, because we live in societies that value health more than anything else, and that is why biomedicalization has become the driving force of the psychedelic renaissance. There would be no psychedelic renaissance without biomedicalization. And if biomedicalization fails, I would predict that the psychedelic renaissance will collapse. And collapsing means we go back to underground use, where people do whatever they want to do and risk punishment, or there is a decriminalized world in which they, these uses are tolerated and they will just do it at their own risk.
Is there no alternative to the biomedical model?
The alternative to the biomedical model would be religious use. I think that's the second strongest path to institutionalization. And that has had some success. So the US Supreme Court, for example, accepted both ayahuasca use by UDV and by Santo Daime. And I think there is a third church by now that has been accepted. But this is very minor compared with the biomedicalization. And it's even more uncharted regulatory territory, because in the American case, it's the Drug Enforcement Agency which basically has to decide whether a church is allowed to use the substance. And that's not really their job. I mean, that's even less the DEA's job than it is the FDA's job to regulate psychotherapy. What are these drug enforcement officers? I mean, how are they going to decide which theologies are, legit and which are not? And I mean, Timothy Leary argued that the path to widespread use of psychedelics would be, by everybody starting their own dope church, and that just failed. I mean, the authorities did not allow that to happen, and so now we have like 2-3 dope churches basically who are considered established enough to do this, and of course there is Native American Church, but it's just not a very clear-cut path forward, and I think there will probably continue to be like a marginal place for this under religious freedom, but I don't think that that's going to bring psychedelics into mainstream society in the way that medicalization could.
Timothy Leary, as far as I remember, had another idea about training people how to use psychedelics and giving out licenses, such as driving licenses. And that could be a secularized model to regulate these substances. What do you think about that?
Yeah, in Germany, the philosopher Thomas Metzinger also proposed that in the early 2000s, having a driver's license for psychedelics. And I kind of like that idea. I think, I guess, my own intuitions tend to be on the libertarian side. I think if people want to self-experiment with the substance, there should be a path towards doing that. At the same time, I recognize that, I've been trained as a physician. I bring medical and pharmacological literacy with me. I'm psychologically stable enough to, experiment with different substances without ever having encountered any serious problems. And that is not the case for everybody. Right, so I'm cautious about legalization and in some ways even about decriminalization because I think they will come at a cost, and they will not be for free. And if you advocate these drug policies, you will also have to tolerate that there will be some victims. And a driver's license model is a way in which you enable people access while also regulating it. And then, of course, the question is how high is the bar, right? And what exactly would you expect beyond the theoretical testing? Because if you look at drug abuse among physicians, for example, it's the anesthesiologists who have most problems, right? And there is plenty of anesthesiologists who suffer from drug addiction. So it's not the case that just, having a profound understanding of the pharmacology would protect you against running into trouble. That is to say, it would have to go along probably with some kind of personality testing and with developing, a practical framework, with teaching people how to use things without getting into trouble. And despite driver's licenses, we do have a lot of car accidents, and people are also dying in these accidents. So, I think one also shouldn't fool oneself and think that everything is going to be safe just because we introduce a driver's license. But I do sort of the libertarian, drug libertarian in me likes the idea. So.